The morning sun had barely peeked over the Rocky Mountains when Captain Jack Chen walked through Denver International Airport's bustling corridors. His crisp blue uniform and confident stride reflected his 15 years of flying experience. But something about today felt different, a subtle tension in the air that every seasoned pilot learns to notice. As Jack performed his usual pre-flight checks in the cockpit of the small regional aircraft, he could hear the growing commotion from the boarding area. The familiar sounds of rolling suitcases and quiet conversations were suddenly overshadowed by loud, rough laughter and heavy boots stomping up the boarding stairs. Through the cockpit window, Jack caught glimpses of leather jackets and chains, 6 burly men wearing patches of a local motorcycle club. Their leader, a tall figure with a thick beard and sunglasses despite the early hour, was already causing a stir. He shoved his way past an elderly couple, earning disapproving looks from other passengers. Flight attendant Amy Lee, who had worked with Jack on countless flights before, knocked on the cockpit door. Her usually cheerful face showed concern as she stepped inside. "We've got a situation brewing," she whispered. "These bikers, they're already refusing to store their jackets properly and giving attitude to everyone around them." Jack nodded, his mind already running through various scenarios. The flight to Albuquerque wasn't long, but in a small 30-seat aircraft, troublesome passengers could quickly become a serious problem. He'd dealt with difficult situations before, but something about this group set off warning bells in his mind. As the last passengers settled in, the noise level from the cabin grew louder. The bikers had spread themselves throughout the middle section of the plane, creating what felt like a territorial barrier. Other passengers, a mix of business people, families, and tourists, tried to shrink into their seats, clearly uncomfortable with the brewing tension. Through the cabin camera feed, Jack observed the leader, who kept his sunglasses on and sprawled across his seat as if it were a throne. His boots deliberately stuck out into the aisle, forcing other passengers to awkward sideways shuffles as they passed. 2 of his companions were already ignoring the seatbelt signs, standing to reach into the overhead compartments repeatedly, more to assert their presence than from any real need. Jack began his standard pre-flight announcements, his voice calm and professional. But as he spoke about safety procedures, he'd heard mocking laughter from the cabin. Through the camera, he could see the bikers making exaggerated gestures, mimicking his instructions with obvious disdain. Amy returned to the cockpit one last time before takeoff. "Their leader calls himself Ghost," she reported. "He demanded double servings of everything before we've even left the ground. The others keep making comments about teaching people respect once we're in the air." As Jack guided the aircraft onto the runway, his mind was already working on a plan. In his decade and a half of flying, he'd learned that situations like these rarely improved on their own. The confined space of an aircraft at 30,000 feet was like a pressure cooker. Tensions only grew higher as the flight progressed. The engines roared to life, and the small aircraft began its takeoff roll. Jack could feel the familiar surge of power, but today it came with an extra weight of responsibility. He wasn't just responsible for flying the plane anymore. He needed to ensure the safety and comfort of every passenger on board, especially with this unpredictable element in the cabin. As the aircraft lifted off the ground, leaving the safety of Denver behind, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this flight was about to become one of the most challenging of his career. What he didn't know yet was that his unique background and skills would soon be put to the test in ways nobody could have expected. The plane had barely reached its cruising altitude when the first real signs of trouble began. Ghost, still wearing his sunglasses in the dimly lit cabin, snapped his fingers repeatedly at flight attendant Amy Lee. His voice carried through the cabin, deliberately loud enough for everyone to hear. "Hey, sweetheart, where's that drink service? We've been waiting forever." The other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A young mother pulled her child closer, while a businessman pretending to work on his laptop watched the scene unfold from the corner of his eye. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. Amy maintained her professional composure, approaching with a practiced smile. "Sir, we'll begin our beverage service shortly. Please make sure your seatbelt remains fastened while the sign is illuminated." Her voice was steady, but her knuckles were white as she gripped her service cart. Ghost's friend from the row behind, a stocky man with a bandana, leaned forward. Maybe you didn't hear him right, lady. We're thirsty now. His words came out like a growl, making several nearby passengers flinch. Through the cabin camera, Captain Jack could see the situation unfolding. His jaw tightened as he watched Amy try to maintain order. The bikers had created their own zone of chaos in the middle of the plane, speaking loudly and ignoring basic flight etiquette. "These seats are garbage," Ghost announced to no one in particular, kicking the seat in front of him. An elderly man sitting there gripped his armrests but stayed silent. "Can't even stretch my legs properly in this tin can." Two of the bikers got up despite the illuminated seatbelt sign, bumping into seats as they made their way to the tiny bathroom at the back. They took their time, blocking the aisle and making comments about other passengers as they passed. Amy tried to intervene. "Gentlemen, please return to your seats. It's for your safety while..." Ghost cut her off with a dismissive wave. "Safety? Lady, we ride steel horses at 100 miles per hour. Don't talk to us about safety." The other bikers laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the cabin. A teenage girl who had been reading put her book away and put on her headphones, trying to make herself invisible. Her father watched the situation with growing concern, his hand protectively on her shoulder. In the cockpit, Jack's co-pilot Tom Wu glanced at him with worry. "Should we radio ahead? Get security ready at the landing?" But Jack knew they were only 20 minutes into a 2-hour flight. A lot could happen before they reached Albuquerque. The tension peaked when one of the bikers pulled out his phone, ignoring repeated requests to put it in airplane mode. "Make me," he challenged Emmy, his voice carrying an unmistakable threat. The other bikers joined in, pulling out their phones and making a show of typing and swiping. A baby started crying somewhere in the back of the plane, and Ghost's group responded with exaggerated groans and loud complaints. "Can't someone shut that kid up?" one of them shouted, causing the infant's mother to burst into tears while trying to comfort her child. The situation was rapidly becoming untenable. Other passengers were exchanging worried glances, some pressing their call buttons only to quickly cancel them, afraid of drawing attention to themselves. The usual gentle hum of the aircraft engines now felt like a backdrop to a powder keg ready to explode. Annie made her way back to the cockpit, her hands slightly shaking as she input the security code. "Captain," she whispered after slipping inside, "they're getting worse. They've been making comments about what they'll do once we land, trying to intimidate the other passengers. Ghost keeps saying he knows people at our destination who'll make us regret any trouble we give them." Jack watched the cabin camera feed intently. He could see Ghost's group growing bolder, their territory in the middle of the plane becoming like a small kingdom of chaos. They were testing boundaries, seeing how far they could push before someone pushed back. What they didn't realize was that high above the clouds, in this pressurized tube moving through the sky at hundreds of miles per hour, they weren't the ones in control. And Captain Jack Chen, with his particular set of skills and experience, was about to teach them a lesson they'd never forget, all without laying a finger on them or breaking a single aviation regulation. The breaking point came exactly 45 minutes into the flight. The cabin air grew thick with tension as Ghost reached into his leather jacket pocket and pulled out a cigarette. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin as he held it between his fingers, twirling it like a tiny baton. "Sir," Amy's voice carried a tremor she couldn't quite hide, "smoking is strictly prohibited on all flights." She stood at the end of the aisle, her hands clasped tightly in front of her uniform. Ghost's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Really? And who's going to stop me?" He pulled out a lighter, letting it catch the cabin lights. The elderly couple in front of him quickly pressed their call buttons, while a businessman 3 rows back pretended to be absorbed in his newspaper, though his white-knuckled grip on the pages told a different story. 2 of Ghost's companions stood up, deliberately positioning themselves in the aisle to block anyone from approaching. "Just having a smoke break," one announced loudly. "Anyone got a problem with that?" His challenge hung in the air, met only by nervous silence. In the cockpit, Captain Jack watched the scene unfold on the cabin monitor. His co-pilot Tom's face had gone pale. "This is getting out of hand," Tom whispered. "We should alert ground control." But before Jack could respond, the situation escalated further. Ghost flicked his lighter, the small flame dancing dangerously close to the cigarette. A child in the back began to cry, and his mother's attempts to quiet him only seemed to amuse the bikers more. Amy tried one last time to maintain order. "Sir, I must insist." Her words were cut short as Ghost's largest companion, a man who barely fit in his seat, suddenly lurched to his feet. "Listen, lady," he growled, "either back off or—" The threat died in his throat as the plane hit a small pocket of turbulence. It wasn't much, just enough to make him stumble slightly. The lighter flew from Ghost's hand, clattering down the aisle. But instead of backing down, Ghost's expression darkened. "That's it," he snarled, standing up despite the freshly illuminated seatbelt sign. "Time to have a chat with the guy flying this thing." He took a step toward the cockpit, his intentions clear. The other passengers watched in horror as 3 of his companions joined him, creating a wall of leather and threatening presence in the narrow aisle. A young teacher chaperoning a student quietly began filming with her phone, her hands shaking but determined to document whatever was about to happen. Amy positioned herself between the group and the cockpit door. "This is a restricted area," she said, her voice stronger now, fueled by the responsibility of protecting her flight deck. "Return to your seats immediately, or we'll be forced to take serious action." Ghost laughed, the sound devoid of any real humor. "Serious action? Up here? Lady, we are the serious action." He took another step forward, his friends crowding behind him like a pack of wolves. Through the camera feed, Jack could see the fear in his passenger's eyes. The businessman had finally put down his newspaper, now watching openly. The elderly couple were holding hands, and the young mother in the back had pulled her child onto her lap, wrapping her arms around him protectively. The tension in the cabin had reached a breaking point. Ghost was just steps away from the cockpit door, his intentions clearly hostile. Other passengers were now pressing their call buttons repeatedly, creating a symphony of soft dings that only added to the chaos. In the cockpit, Jack took a slow, deep breath. He'd hoped it wouldn't come to this, but Ghost and his crew had crossed a line. They thought they were in control of the situation, but they'd forgotten one crucial detail. At 30,000 feet, they were in Jack's world, and he was about to remind them of that fact in a way they'd never forget. His hand moved to the aircraft's controls, his mind already mapping out the series of perfectly legal maneuvers that would turn this situation around, literally and figuratively. These bikers were about to learn that sometimes the biggest mistakes come from underestimating the person they're trying to intimidate. What Ghost and his gang didn't know, what none of the passengers knew, was that Captain Jack Chen wasn't just another commercial airline pilot. The calm, professional demeanor they'd heard over the intercom masked a background that would have made even the most hardened troublemaker think twice. Before joining the airline industry, Jack had spent 12 years in the Air Force, but not just as any pilot. He'd been part of an elite squadron specializing in high-stress combat situations. His missions had taken him through the worst turbulence zones in the world, flying through conditions that would make today's situation feel like a walk in the park. In the cockpit, as Ghost's heavy footsteps approached, Jack's mind flashed back to one particular mission over the mountains of Afghanistan. His aircraft had been caught in a sudden storm, with wind speeds that could tear a lesser plane apart. Instead of panicking, he used the wind to his advantage, working with the natural forces to keep his crew safe. That day, he'd learned that sometimes the best way to handle a hostile situation wasn't to fight it head-on, but to use it against itself. Tom, his co-pilot, noticed a subtle change in Jack's posture. Gone was the regular airline captain. In his place sat a combat veteran with over 3,000 hours of tactical flight experience. Jack's hands moved to the controls with practiced precision, his movements so smooth that most passengers wouldn't notice anything unusual. During his military career, Jack had also trained in something few people knew about: the art of using aircraft dynamics to maintain control in hostile situations. He'd learned that a plane could be more than just transportation. In skilled hands, it could become an instrument of peaceful conflict resolution. "You know what my flight instructor used to say?" Jack spoke softly to Tom, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "The real test of a pilot isn't how they handle clear skies, it's what they do when the storm hits." His fingers tapped thoughtfully on the control yoke as he recalled the countless hours spent in simulators, practicing maneuvers that most commercial pilots never needed to use. There had been another incident 2 years into his commercial career when a drunk passenger had tried to rush the cockpit. Instead of making an emergency landing, Jack had used his knowledge of flight dynamics to create an environment where the troublemaker couldn't maintain his balance long enough to cause problems. The situation had been resolved without any physical confrontation, earning him a quiet commendation from airline management. Through the cabin camera, Jack could see Ghost getting closer to the cockpit door. The biker's confident stride reminded him of another lesson from his military days, how the most dangerous opponents were often the ones who underestimated the situation they were in. Jack had spent years learning about the psychology of confrontation at altitude. He understood how the reduced oxygen, the confined space, and the constant background noise could affect people's behavior. More importantly, he knew how to use these factors to his advantage without putting anyone at risk. His training had covered everything from basic aerodynamics to advanced crowd control techniques specific to aircraft. He'd learned that at cruising altitude, even the slightest adjustment to the plane's attitude could have a significant impact on passenger comfort, knowledge that was about to become very relevant. As Ghost reached the front of the cabin, Jack made a series of subtle adjustments to the cabin pressure, nothing dangerous, just enough to create a slight feeling of disorientation. It was a technique he'd learned during his special operations training, one that could affect troublemakers without endangering other passengers. The timing couldn't have been better. Just as Ghost was about to make his final move toward the cockpit, Jack prepared to demonstrate why challenging a pilot in his own domain was never a wise decision, especially when that pilot had spent years training for situations exactly like this. Captain Jack's first move was so subtle that most passengers barely noticed it. He adjusted the plane's trim just slightly, creating a sensation of gentle swaying. Through the cabin camera, he watched as Ghost grabbed the back of a seat to steady himself, his confident stride faltering for just a moment. "What was that?" Tom whispered, noticing the adjustment on his instruments. "Watch and learn," Jack replied quietly, his hands steady on the controls. He'd practiced these maneuvers countless times in simulators, knowing exactly how much pressure to apply without compromising safety. The next adjustment came as Ghost took another step toward the cockpit. Jack introduced a slight roll motion, barely noticeable on the instruments but enough to make standing in the aisle increasingly uncomfortable. The airplane gently swayed from side to side, like a boat on calm waters. Ghost's game members, who had been blocking the aisle, suddenly found themselves reaching for support. Their tough guy poses looked less intimidating as they struggled to maintain their balance. One of them stumbled slightly, bumping into an empty seat. "Getting a bit bumpy, folks," Jack announced over the intercom, his voice professionally calm. "Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." He emphasized the last part, knowing full well that standing up was becoming increasingly challenging. The elderly couple who had been terrified earlier now watched with poorly concealed smiles as their tormentors struggled to look dignified. The businessman who had hidden behind his newspaper lowered it just enough to observe the scene unfolding. Jack continued his masterful manipulation of the aircraft. Each movement was precisely calculated, a slight pitch here, a gentle roll there. Nothing extreme enough to spill a drink, but more than enough to make walking a straight line impossible. Ghost, now only a few rows from the cockpit, grabbed another seat back as the plane entered what felt like light turbulence. His sunglasses slipped down his nose, and for the first time, uncertainty flashed across his face. "Must be some weather ahead," Jack announced professionally. He adjusted the air pressure ever so slightly, creating a subtle but persistent feeling of disorientation. It was a technique he'd learned during his military days, perfectly safe but remarkably effective. One of Ghost's companions suddenly sat down, his face taking on a greenish tinge. Another quickly followed suit, no longer interested in maintaining their intimidating presence in the aisle. The young mother in the back noticed this change and hugged her child closer, this time hiding a smile. The plane entered another series of gentle rolls. Ghost, still determined to reach the cockpit, found himself swaying like a drunk man on a moving train. His attempt to look menacing was undermined by his desperate grip on the seats. "Folks, the turbulence may continue for a while," Jack's voice came over the intercom again. "For your comfort and safety, please remain seated. Our flight attendants will suspend service until conditions improve." Through it all, Jack maintained perfect control. Each movement was precisely executed, using his knowledge of aerodynamics to create an environment where standing simply wasn't practical. The other passengers, safely buckled in their seats, experienced nothing more than mild discomfort. Tom watched in amazement as the situation transformed. The bikers who had seemed so threatening on the ground were now being humbled by nothing more than skilled piloting and the laws of physics. No confrontation, no violence, just the subtle mastery of flight dynamics. Ghost, now looking decidedly unwell, finally admitted defeat. As he stumbled back to his seat, the plane gave one final gentle roll, as if the universe itself was telling him to sit down and behave. The message was clear. In this domain, altitude and attitude were controlled by one person only, and it wasn't the man in the leather jacket. Captain Jack had now entered what he privately called the zone, that perfect state of focus where every movement, every adjustment was precisely calculated. His hands moved across the controls with the confidence of someone who had mastered their craft through years of experience. "Notice what I'm doing here," he quietly explained to Tom. "It's all about timing." He made a minor adjustment to the plane's pitch, coinciding perfectly with Ghost's attempt to stand up again. The biker immediately dropped back into his seat, his face showing the first signs of airsickness. The cabin had become Jack's orchestra, and he was conducting a masterpiece of aviation control. Each gentle roll was timed to counter any aggressive movement from the troublemakers. When one of Ghost's friends tried to reach for the overhead compartment, a subtle dip made him think twice. Through the cabin camera, Jack could see the transformation taking place. The bikers who had been so bold on the ground were now gripping their armrests. Their faces, once twisted with arrogance, now showed a mix of confusion and growing discomfort. "Hey boss," one of them called out to Ghost, his voice noticeably less confident. "Maybe we should just chill for a bit." The suggestion was met with a weak nod from their leader, whose sunglasses couldn't hide the beads of sweat on his forehead. Jack introduced another series of supple movements, nothing dramatic, just enough to create a constant state of mild disorientation. It was like a dance, with the aircraft responding to his every command. Each adjustment was so precise that the other passengers, safely buckled in their seats, barely noticed anything unusual. The businessman who had earlier hidden behind his newspaper now washed openly, a knowing smile playing on his lips. He'd flown enough to recognize that this was no ordinary turbulence. The elderly couple exchanged glances, their earlier fear replaced by barely concealed amusement. Emmy, the flight attendant, caught on to what was happening. She made her way down the aisle with perfect balance, years of experience allowing her to move smoothly despite the gentle swaying. "Would any of you gentlemen like air sickness bags?" she asked innocently, pausing near Ghost's row. The plane entered another series of calculated movements. Jack had learned this technique during a particularly challenging mission over the Pacific, how to use the aircraft's natural dynamics to maintain complete control without causing actual distress to passengers. Ghost's companions were now sitting quietly, their earlier bravado completely deflated. One of them had already used his air sickness bag, while another stared straight ahead, his knuckles white on the armrests. Their leader, Ghost himself, had finally removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes that were desperately trying to focus on anything stable. "Just a patch of uneven air," Jack announced over the intercom, his voice carrying just a hint of amusement. "Nothing to worry about, folks. We'll be experiencing this mild turbulence for the next little while." Through it all, Jack maintained perfect control of the aircraft. Each movement was within normal safety parameters, but timed and executed in a way that targeted only those who insisted on being troublemakers. It was like watching a chess master at work, every move serving a purpose, every adjustment part of a larger strategy. The other passengers had become an appreciative audience to this display of skill. The young teacher who had been filming earlier quietly put away her phone, realizing she was witnessing something better than any confrontation, the perfect demonstration of how expertise and intelligence could overcome brute force. As the plane began its descent into Albuquerque, the transformation in the cabin was remarkable. Ghost and his gang, once so intimidating, sat quietly in their seats, their faces a mix of pale green and defeat. The leader's sunglasses were now tucked away, his earlier bravado replaced by a clear desire for the flight to end. "Starting our final approach," Captain Jack announced smoothly over the intercom. "Please make sure your seatbelts are securely fastened." There was no need to emphasize the last part. None of the bikers had any intention of moving from their seats. Through the cabin camera, Jack could see the other passengers trying to hide their smiles. The elderly couple who had been terrorized earlier now sat contentedly, occasionally glancing back at their former tormentors with barely concealed satisfaction. The businessman had finally put away his newspaper completely, enjoying the show's final act. Hemi moved confidently through the cabin, collecting air sickness bags, most of them used by Ghost's group. "Don't worry," she said kindly to one of the bikers who was clutching his bag like a lifeline. "We're almost there." Her voice carried just a hint of sweet revenge. As the plane descended through the clouds, Jack executed one final series of gentle movements, nothing dramatic, just enough to remind the troublemakers who was really in control. Ghost, who had threatened to teach people respect just hours ago, now looked like he might cry with relief at the sight of the approaching runway. The landing was perfect, smooth, and professional. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, local security officers were already waiting on the tarmac, having been quietly notified about the earlier disturbance. But they were in for a surprise. Instead of the rowdy group they'd expected to deal with, they found 6 very subdued bikers, each one practically rushing to exit the aircraft. Ghost, who could barely look the flight attendants in the eye, mumbled something that sounded suspiciously like sorry as he hurried past. The other passengers took their time gathering their belongings, exchanging knowing looks and subtle smiles. The young mother whose child had been frightened earlier now watched calmly as her little one waved goodbye to Emmy, all traces of fear long gone. "That was incredible," Tom whispered to Jack in the cockpit. "I've never seen anything like it." Jack just smiled, beginning his post-flight checks with the same careful attention he gave to everything else. News of the incident spread quickly through the airline's crew network. In the following weeks, it became something of a legend, the story of how one pilot had turned a potentially dangerous situation into a masterclass in conflict resolution, all without laying a finger on anyone. The airline's training department quietly added a new case study to their manual, though they changed the names to protect privacy. It became known as the turbulence technique, a perfect example of how knowledge, skill, and creative thinking could overcome aggression without escalation. As for Captain Jack Chen, he filed a simple incident report documenting the unexpected turbulence with professional detachment. But occasionally, when new pilots asked him about handling difficult passengers, a small smile would cross his face as he shared his favorite piece of advice. "Remember, folks, at 30,000 feet, attitude is everything."